Okay, so I think we'll make a start. A very warm welcome to you, everyone, for joining us here this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you're joining us from. We're really happy to be here for our latest methodological expert webinar as part of our special issue initiative that we're running with the Journal of Supply Chain Management, which is focused on novel ways of doing qualitative research in supply chain management. And today our focus is on visual methods. This is really going to certainly opened my eyes already from my conversations with the speakers to diverse, novel, creative, insightful new ways of thinking about researching using qualitative data, particularly of a visual sort. And as you'll see from our discussions, there's a lot of diversity and a lot of ways of thinking about this. So we're really excited to have you here to hear our presentations today for this webinar. I think we can move to, before I say that, before we move, actually, sorry, we are joined by Nicola Bateman and Lauren McCarthy. So we're really happy to have them and to welcome them. Before I introduce them formally, we'll move on to the next slide, Eugenia. And we just wanted to make a few announcements. If you've been with us before, on some of our previous webinar events, you'll know a bit of the structure of how we do things. The first thing we wanted to acknowledge is that we're really happy, really excited to welcome Julia Grimm from Stockholm University to join us as a member of the guest editor team. Julia, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, just very shortly, perhaps. I'm really excited to be part of the team. I'm very much looking forward to read some interesting proposals soon. Some are already starting to drop in, so it's a very interesting process. And for those who don't know me, I'm a qualitative researcher, mostly approach research sites with a process lens. And also do ethnography. And I'm mostly interested in better understanding how, through collaboration and governance, supply chains can be made more sustainable. So that's what I'm doing, and I hope I can bring in an interesting perspective into the team.
Absolutely. Thanks, Julia. So yes, as we say, we're really happy to be able to expand our scope of expertise and our capacity as we move into the developmental phase of the initiative, which will begin after the deadline for September 30th for the proposal. So just as a reminder of that. But before then, we just wanted to highlight some of the upcoming events that we've got over the next couple of months. So the exciting thing to announce is that next coming up in June, very soon, very shortly actually, is another new type of event we're running as part of the initiative, which we're calling deep dive and pitch sessions for you to be able to join us. So these follow on the back of the previous webinars we've run around ethnography and discourse studies. And so what we'll be able to do in these sessions is to dive a little bit deeper, supported by experts in their fields, some of who you'll have seen before from the previous webinars and some who will be new, to be able to address some of the detailed questions that came up in previous webinars on these methodologies that we didn't have a chance to address, but also to give you the chance to pitch your proposal in a very short pitch, but to gain some feedback on the spot from those experts and from the guest editors. So there is a deadline for expressing your interest to pitch, which is the 5th of June. And that's for both the deep dive and pitch on ethnography, which is happening on June 9th, and also the deep dive and pitch on discourse studies, which is happening on June 12th. So do keep an eye on that. And then obviously coming up then after June, we've got conference season, and we'll be holding special sessions at Euroma in Vienna and at the Academy of Management in Philadelphia. And if you would like to join those sessions and to have your proposals considered and sort of be part of that discussion on those days, then you can see the deadlines there for when you need to submit those proposals to us and to indicate your interest in taking part in either Euroma, the deadline for which is June 15th, or Academy of Management, the deadline for which is June 30th. So we hope to see many of you there and to receive your proposals in advance. So we'll move on swiftly to the main event of today's webinar, which is to hear from our excellent speakers. As I say, we've got Professor Nicola Bateman from the University of Leicester and Dr. Lauren McCarthy from Bayes Business School in City St George's. And I think without further ado, what we do need to say, sorry, before we rush on to the presentations, is there will be a chance to have a panel discussion and Q&A at the end of the presentation. So we'll hear both presentations and then we will have some Q&A. So Eugenia and Julia will be monitoring the chat box. So please don't hesitate to post any questions in the chat box. And we will be able to synthesize those and hopefully put as many to our speakers as possible at the end of the session. And I think that's everything. So without further ado, now we will move on to our first speaker, which is Professor Nicola Bateman. I think the floor is yours, Nicola.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh dear, I can see that the slide's a little bit distorted. But never mind, I'm sure they'll read fine. The aspect ratio has gone a bit wonky. They're a bit taller and thinner than they should be, but not to worry. Anyway, I've been working in this field of using visual tools for operational decision making for about 15 years. And as such, I've done quite a wide range of activities. And I've also had to kind of invent some things as we've gone through. So while we were getting ready, I was talking about our image management, image sharing protocol that we had to develop to kind of help researchers deal with images in an ethical way. And that's protocol we've now used in the university for, I don't know, probably 6-7 years. And I probably should formally write that up and share it. So that should hopefully be available in the future. So I have been working in various different types of operations, mostly with a focus on visual. And the next slide, which don't move on to yet, we'll show you in a minute, it kind of takes you through, if you go back one, takes you through kind of why, a little bit about my career and why I chose to focus on visual approach. But shown here is our school at University of Leicester. This is our business school, which has its own campus, which is very handy for events, and do get in touch if you want to. Now, I'm kind of at the end of my career, and I'm really happy to kind of help anyone who wants to kind of do some visual stuff. However, I am retiring at the end of June, but I am being retained as an emeritus professor. So I'm very happy to come and deliver something to do with visual if you want me to. If you cover expenses and are in a nice place, then I'll probably come if I can. So, okay, let's move on to the next slide. And I'll show you a little bit about the kind of how and why, and then it'll give you some context as to what I've done. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of really about my career in visual research, and it started with research into sustainability of continuous improvement activities. And you'll see some references. So the references are all at the end if you want to have a look them up. Hey, can you click the next stage on, please? Yeah, so that's it. Part of this research was about sustainability of process improvement, continuous improvement. And it's through this that I kind of started to realize the importance of what we described as communication boards. So these are boards by which teams and operational teams make decisions. Now, the level that I was looking at, it was mainly within organizations, but also I saw examples of where it was between organizations. And that was, it struck me how powerful it was to use a visual format to make decisions. Okay, I've got a big, that's it. If you can click on the next one. So I then started doing some specific research with a company called Assa Abloy, and I developed some visual management principles for about how to use these screens. And then I started publishing on that as well. Part of this meant that when I was at the British Academy of Management, I did a presentation on it, and I was approached by some more social science researchers to make a contribution to the book that you can see at the top called The Routledge Companion to the Visual Organisation. And so I have a chapter in that book, but there were lots of other chapters that were in there, which was really interesting. And it kind of opened my eyes to a whole load of kind of social science-based visual approaches. And so I engaged with other researchers to develop visual methods. And I was able to incorporate some of those approaches. And I'll reference a couple of those a little bit later on. So from that, I then started seeking funding in this area, and I got funding for research, including, gone back, carry on, stay, no, go back, stay on this one, I'll tell you to move forward in a mo. So I got funding for 2 PhD students. One was internally and one was from the This Institute. For those of you who don't know, they're a very prestigious health institute run at Cambridge. And there's been a lot of interest in kind of use of visual tools in health. And for anyone who kind of goes into a British hospital, I haven't been into, I don't think I've been into any overseas ones, but I suspect they're the same because I see material published. Visual tools are used a lot to support decision making. That can be around management of just a ward, or it can also be looking at patient flows. It can be looking at conceptualization of things like multimorbidity and things like that. Some of those are published in some of my health materials. There's a reference for one at the end here. So then I got involved also with a panel of PhD supervisors in the US, and also advised for a number of grant givers overseas, particularly in the kind of North European countries, Scandinavian countries plus Netherlands. So I started kind of doing more broadly. So that kind of gives you an overview of the kind of things I was doing. And it's spanned a whole load of sectors. We've got food, health and general operations management. If you have a look at the references, you'll see the scope. So my summary is it comes from the power of visual decision making, which informs the kind of things that we're interested in within supply chains. It also seems to cross across lots of different disciplines. And I tend to focus on those who have who are sophisticated enough to be able to take advantage of these approaches. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So what I've done is I've done a summary of the kind of general research process. And then I've added in what the opportunities are for a visual approach at each of those. So if we can click on. So the first thing to think about is sort of the design and methodology. So you can do photo elicitation, you can use video and then extract stills from that. You can use discussion of images where the researcher brings the images. You can use the researcher's photos or sketches, and that there's lots of ways of bringing through ideas that you couldn't through otherwise. Now, when you're doing that, you've then got to think about the ethics of that. So it's permissions for using people's images, and how you deal with that with people's images of people's faces. Now, when I do my workshop about gathering this kind of data, I know the British position, but it is different in different countries. So if you're taking photographs in any country, you need to find out what the legal situation is. If anybody wants to ask me about the British one, I can tell you about that. You then need to have some kind of image management protocol, and as I mentioned, we've developed one at Leicester. And hopefully I'll be able to share that. I haven't actually formally written it up. It just occurred to me I should do it. But hopefully we'll be able to share that if you as a delegate. Now, in terms of ownership of images, the person who takes the photograph owns the image. So if you are going to use someone else's photograph, they have to allow you to use it or transfer ownership of it. There is also the IVSA code, which is the International Visual Sociology Association, which is very useful for exploring some of the kind of ethics. And there's a link to that at the end of this presentation. Okay, So that's the kind of setup stage. The next thing is the actual practice of data gathering. So you then have images that can be created either by the participants, i.e. your subjects, or the researcher. You can discuss images, you can use, you can gather data, like for instance through eye tracking, and you can do document analysis. And for us within supply chains, that might be, for instance, supply chain maps and so on. Okay, so there's lots of things you can do at that stage. Can we have the next click on, please? So then you've got to analyze this. So you could do straight thematic analysis like you do with transcribed interviews, and you can just do themes just like you would. But you can also do, there's various kinds of visual approaches. So just doing mapping of events whereby you're producing maps like a supply chain map. Some visual researchers use a concept of data density, which was developed by a guy called Edward Tufte, and I've used this myself. Again at the Edward Tufte material is at the end. And then there's also other visual approaches called network analysis, which is a more general approach. And then finally, you might not have done any visual elements, but you might want to develop your own images to illustrate your own findings. This it allows you to explore things in a different way. And it's a good way of communicating a lot of data at the same time. And a lot of people do sketches, first of all, to help them think, but also to communicate what they're doing, typically conceptual models, flow diagrams for methodology, that kind of thing. So if we can have the next click on, please. So I delivered 2 workshops, one on visual methods, which focuses on the first half, and then I also do one on outputs. And there's a lot of things you can take into account in designing your outputs, and also making sure that they kind of make sense to other people. And I talk about a kind of visual grammar, and there's very useful, I've synthesized these, but there's lots of useful things you can do to help you do that. I'm always quite strict with my PhD students, and I say, no, that's poor visual grammar, you should do this, this, and this. And so I coach a lot of people through that process. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to show some examples of some nice, from each of these, from some of these stages. So this is a relatively old piece of research, and I found it really inspiring. I'm trying to remember what Emma Bell was one of the people, and I noticed she's been referenced in the second presentation. But essentially it was respondent-led photography, and this is in the days before smartphones, where you had disposable cameras, and it was sort of ethnographic, and it was about organizational members' identities at work, to come and understand how people have a sense of self. And it showed how using photography allows you to find out things that you wouldn't otherwise. So you can see 2 photographs on the left, and they gave a lot of insight into their ways of working. So if you click on a bit, the researchers kind of categorized the photographs into 4 groups: turning the camera on themselves, revealing hiding spaces, traces and objects, and silly piles just mucking about. So revisiting the rejected images. So if we click on again, the top photograph is images of themselves but taken in the back office. So that's turning the camera on themselves, but it also showed kind of what happened behind the scenes in quite a glamorous, hairdressers can be quite sleek places, but typically these were taken where there were boilers, and you can see kind of boiler pipe work in the background. And it showed that the people working in that environment didn't have much space for themselves. And then the bottom one was very poignant, particularly for someone who's been working in a place a long time. What's happening here is the hairdressers was about to be refurbished, and a person took a photograph of where they've worked for 20 years and saying, these marks are me. This is where I've been walking backwards and forwards. So it had a kind of pathos about it, and kind of remembering that event. Anyway, let's move on to the next slide. So this is an analytical approach. This was by one of my PhD students. He's got his PhD and we're now kind of writing up. And this is an analytical tool that he used to understand what was going on. We were looking at these communication boards, and this is quite complicated, so it probably won't be published outside the thesis. I don't really expect you to understand it fully, but basically it shows where different groups of people were pointing. And what it shows is a timestamp, and the different colours relate to different people. So you can see that there's like a focus in the bottom left around food waste, and it allows us to see the flow of the decision-making process. And it acted as kind of support for our evidence about the importance of flow within the design of these boards. So this is an analytical tool that was used to give additional insight in terms of the data that was gathered. And you took the information off a video, but you couldn't show that obviously within a thesis. This is only one of two for this particular conversation, and there are pages and pages of this, but it allows us to provide evidence of the importance of the relative placements of the element of the board. Okay, and we'll move on to the final example. So this is a diagram that I developed, and it's a way of showing the structure of a kind of thematic analysis. What you can see in the center is that there were 5 main themes, but the dominant one was facilitates co-creation. But what I wanted to show was the facilitates co-creation wasn't derived from 2 or 3 subcodes. It was derived from lots of different codes. And so when I talk about this, I don't talk about all of the codes. I talk about these top 5, particularly about facilitates co-creation. And then I just discuss 2 or 3 of those, which in this case are shown on here as facilitates improvement, discourse management, and a shared understanding. This was relating to looking at patient pathways within a hospital. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, I've referenced quite a few sources. So these are some background reading and sources. The top one, Bresciani, even though it's published in a conference and hasn't gone to a full publication, it's really useful framework of thinking about how people use visualizations. And within this framework, they talk about things like inference support, discourse management, directed focus, phrases that I've used over and over again when I'm talking about how people make decisions within supply chains. The other 2 are really much more graphic design focused. So McCandless and Tuft are really useful. Have a look at their websites. They're really beautiful. Don't do it if you're busy, because you'll spend hours looking at all their beautiful diagrams. One of my particular favorites in Information is Beautiful is the dog ownership one. Do take a look. It's great fun. But it'll give you inspiration about ways that you can communicate. And Edward Tuft is very thoughtful and has beautiful books. No doubt they're in your library, but his website's also really useful as well. Okay, so if we move on to the last slide. So my concluding remarks is that having a visual approach provides you with a really good vein of ways of doing research, and it's a good fit for supply chain because we already use lots of visual tools. Okay, if we click in, next one. It's also really useful for getting outputs that are easy to communicate, either with students, but also for executive education. Click the next one. It also provides insights that you wouldn't get in other ways. It can be hard to publish. I think it's getting easier, a little bit more accepted, but it's not easy. And I would say, because of the additional effort that you need to take on ethics, and also with the publication, you need to justify why you're taking that visual approach to yourself. You probably have to do that as well to any editors too. The next two slides are just references, and we don't really need to show them here, but they're just there if anybody wants to have a look. So you can see some of if the slides go out, you can reference those. So I think that's me finished.
Thank you so much, Nicola. That was a really excellent starting point for us to be able to, as you say, give that overview. And I think what's remarkable from my perspective is just the sheer diversity of all the different types of visuals and sources that you can, capture under this umbrella of visuals. And particularly, as you say, supply chain is perhaps already a richer source than we might have already, originally think of in terms of the visuals that are already available. That are being used, as you say, in decision making, across the board, and what can that reveal to us if we took that seriously as sources of data? So that's fascinating. Thank you so much for kicking us off, and we'll now move on to Lauren. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks very much. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lauren McCarthy. I'm a reader at Bayes Business School at City St George's, and hi from a slightly rainy London today. So could I go to the next slide, please, Eugenia? So I'm going to focus in a little bit more from Nicola's presentation and actually focus on what's been called participant-led visual methods. And thank you, Nicola, for that, starting us off, because I think this is a really nice intro. So Russ Vince and Sam Warren define participant-led visual methods as methods that enable research participants to express themselves visually, such as asking them to create an artifact, draw, recount their dreams, or take photographs. But of course, this is a 2012 reference. And if we go to the next slide, with a warning, sorry, Victoria, you did say, give the audience a warning. Yeah, there's a quite graphic image here as an example. But the reason why I put this here is that it's another really good example of how participant-made photographs can be used within a research project. This is an image from a paper by Slitskaya et al. At the bottom there, you can see the reference. And they were examining masculinity and what's been called dirty work within factory workplaces. And they argue in this methods paper that using photo voice or photography really enabled the men that they were interviewing to open up about their experiences of masculinity at work. And so already you can see a theme here about how visual methods can be super helpful for tricky or more sensitive topics. But there are other kind of participant-led visual methods that you can tap into. Lots of these come from both development studies, social work. There's a visual studies exists as its own discipline as well. But I mean, I've read papers in organisation studies which ask participants to create crafts, to engage in pottery. Participants have been asked to use video cameras to capture how it is to work in their workplace. There's photo voice. There's drawing, which I'm going to focus on as my experience has mainly been in asking our participants to draw. And also body mapping, which is a really fascinating technique that has been taken from health research, where you essentially ask your participant to draw a map of their body. And then you might ask them, for example, how has work impacted your physical health? Can you draw for me on the sheet of paper how this particular workplace has impacted you? And the reference on the screen there, the Guerrero Valle et al. 2025, is a paper which explores Amazon workers in warehouses, and they use body mapping to capture what that kind of quite intense warehouse work was like for that particular form of supply chain worker. Could we jump to the next slide, please? This is another really recent example from some of my colleagues who are in geography at the University of Nottingham, and this is from their Invisible Workers project. Here they were working with women garment workers in Jordan, and they were co-designing and co-creating maps, industrial maps of these EPZs in Lebanon, and kind of getting the participants' own view of this particular area. So where were the areas safe or unsafe, and so on. And so they're really fascinating using participant created maps to better understand the supply chain from their perspective. Next slide, please. So my research contexts have tend to look at production zones in a wide range of different countries, most recently in Cambodia, but the examples that I'm going to draw on mainly look at my research exploring gender in cocoa farming in Ghana, so quite diverse. But I generally tend to research gender equity and equality and how it intersects with sustainability. So for me, one of my research questions were, how have experiences of gender changed for men and women producers involved in CSR supply chain programs? Next slide, please. So in some ways, quite a simple research question, but actually when you start to research contexts that for me are very different from my own background, from my own knowledge base, from my own positionality, I started to think about what methods would be more suitable to better capture what participants felt themselves. And so there were lots of questions that I was asking myself when I started this research. And these questions continue to kind of haunt me at night when I'm working on a new project. So particularly for many of you who are trying to grapple with, I guess, more fuzzy concepts like, I don't know, fairness or sustainability or equality, how do you actually capture what that means for different people working in different parts of the supply chain, where you might have cultural, geographic, linguistic differences, and not to mention the complexities of things like gender as well. So for that reason, I sat upon a particular methodology. Next slide, please. Now, I use something called the Gender Action Learning System, helpfully shortened to GALS, which was developed by development specialist Linda Mayu in 2012. And these are just a couple of photographs of me using them. And you can see that, the setting of doing this very participatory research is quite, in a way, quite informal, quite having to be quite flexible with the situations that were thrown up. But I worked with a local NGO and with the cocoa supplier to set up these particular focus groups. And within the focus groups, we asked participants to draw something that's been called the gender tree. And it's on the next slide, please. So this is the gender balance tree. And it's a diagram. So it's not a free drawing. So some other people who use visual drawing as a method just ask people to draw a way of capturing something about their work or their personality. This is much more applied and much more systematic. And for me, this was helpful working across very different cultural contexts. Now, very quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, the tree tries to capture who does what on the cocoa farm, split by gender or shared, who owns what on the farm. So for example, who owns the land, who owns the membership to be a cocoa farmer, and then who spends, so who has those decision-making capacities and what are they spending their money on. So if you go to the next slide, these are two examples. So I developed the symbols that we were using alongside the local NGO ahead of starting the focus groups so that we could start to get a bit of a shared language. And some of these symbols, the collection on the right is the one I'm looking at. These were kind of suggested to me by the Ghanaian suppliers who better understood, what kind of tools were farmers using and what would they understand by this kind of drawing. The example on the left is one of the farmer's own gender tree drawings, where she has drawn, who's doing what on the farm, who's owning what, and then who's getting to spend. And so we then had, in the end, I think we had about 152 of these diagrams. We did 4 focus groups across different locations in Ghana. And all of the diagrams were photographed by me so that then I could take them home and code them later using the symbol sheet. So it's a content analysis approach here to capturing the visual. And all of these focus groups were supplemented by conversation. So we then talked about the gender trees. So visually, by coding the drawings that the farmers had done, we were able to capture for the NGO and for the supplier what work was being done by who. And this was really important because some of the things that we uncovered were that women were doing lots of the cocoa work. They were specifically taking part in work that was relevant to the quality of the cocoa, such as the drying of the cocoa. So that meant the cocoa supplier was super interested in that point, but also they were not being fairly rewarded. And for a fair trade supplier like this, that was worrying because, you know, if you're working on the land and you're doing the work, then you should be getting some of that reward. So this was really important, and also for us as researchers, interesting from a gender perspective. The next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk through some of the benefits of the visual method that I used here, just to kind of inspire you really to maybe have a go yourself. So first of all, I've used visual methods in various different settings, different countries, and they're really good at opening up people, basically. If you're finding it hard to get beyond the corporate line or raise issues that maybe people don't want to talk about, using the visual can be a really good way of doing that. Sometimes with a lot of laughter, actually. So I've loads of the farmers was just kept laughing and being like, oh my goodness, this is like going back to school. What is this crazy white woman asking us to do? You know, and there was initially a little bit of resistance, particularly from the men, actually. But then everyone kind of settled into it, and there was almost like a party atmosphere of everyone joining in and drawing their tree, and then a bit of competition about whose was best and so on. But more seriously, it allowed us to have a serious conversation about the gender workload without blame, because men were able to see, you know, these are the trees, look how unbalanced they are. And so you can see the last sentence of this quotation from one of the men, you can see when it comes to the roots of the tree, it's somewhat destroying the woman. So this visual is a way of elicitating these reflections on gender and fairness within the supply chain, but also in the household, which is really important for actually tackling gender inequity. Next slide, please. So participant-led visual methods are participatory. So if you're going to go down this route, you need to kind of be on board with a more interpretive, participatory, almost action research type approach to doing research. So this isn't about you as a researcher always leading the way, but it's about trying to put the pencil or the pen in the participant's hand and let them draw and own their own data, and often also voice their opinion. Something that I wasn't expecting that I found in Ghana is that actually using the visuals broke down some of that power imbalance also between the supplier and the farmers. So the supplier, the quotation at the bottom said, they are smart, and I wasn't expecting them to be that smart, and you cannot force things on them. And I learned with a little bit of help that women can do marvelous things. So there's that kind of unintended consequence of doing this more participatory and visual research that, again, opens up a bit more of a conversation between the supplier, the NGO, and the farmers about, you know, their agency, I suppose you could say. Can you do the next slide, please? So initially, the NGO I worked with was deeply skeptical about using these visual methods because there's a high rate of non-literacy or reduced schooling years among cocoa farmers in Ghana. But actually, I found that apart from maybe one of the 152 participants, everybody could take part. And it kind of enabled another way of talking across linguistic barriers. But I think even beyond this kind of linguistic barrier, the visual enables us to capture emotions, feelings, meanings in a new, different way. It is such a powerful way to supplement the verbal evidence that we are really comfortable with collecting as qualitative researchers with something else. And yeah, I've tried using this with CSR professionals, with managers in the UK. Everyone is always a little bit resistant. or they're laughing, but eventually there's so much that is revealed, I think, about through using the visual. So some of the limitations, I think maybe we can discuss some of this in our Q&A. Like any kind of emotionally charged topics, you need to be prepared, and these need to be handled well. If you're using assistants, other researchers, translators, they also need to be well trained. So for example, it's never okay to kind of grab the pen out of someone's hand and sort of take over from them, even though sometimes, if any of you have small children, you might have that same kind of frustration sometimes when they're like not getting on with it quick enough, but that's not what this is about. So you need patience and a good sense of humour. As Nicola was talking about, there's lots of ethical considerations from the design of the research through to permissions and trying to use photographs in publications. Data management was much more complex than I thought about, like trying to photograph all of these visuals before the farmers took them away. So for me, it was really important that farmers were allowed to keep their drawings. And so that meant I had to make sure I could photograph and then video the focus groups for data to use later. And of course, there's many different ways of analysing the visual, so thinking about that before you design. And I've also included a couple of really useful references from the organisation studies domain, but there are many, many, many more. So if you just click through to the last 2 slides, you'll see, again, some references. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was excellent. Perfect. So I think there's just a quick reminder there on the slide of all of the things coming up, but I think, Eugenie, we can stop sharing now. And we've got a couple of minutes to be able to have a discussion and put some questions to our speakers. So if you have any questions, then please do post in the chat. Charles, I can see a question from you. Perhaps could you elaborate a little bit more on what you're referring to there with that question? That would be helpful, and we can put it to the speakers. And I suppose the question that perhaps we could kick off with, I can see Julia's put one in the comment box there, so maybe we'll start off with that one, is what kind of other data sources do you usually draw on alongside visuals? I think that alludes or sort of links to something I was thinking with. It feels like it's very complementary to other discussions we've been having around, you know, ethnography research, or you know, even doing focus groups, which we might be comfortable with, but maybe not with using visuals as part of that element. So yeah, can I put that question to both you and so Lauren and Nicola? What kind of other data sources then do you usually draw alongside visuals? Lauren, would you like to?
Yeah, sorry. Shall I go first?
Go, of course. Thanks, Nicola.
So I did an analysis of data density, which is basically more of a quantitative approach. It's saying how many data points per square meter is there in this visual. So Tuft says that people enjoy using data dense visualizations because they're satisfying. When people talk about what they want in their visualizations they often say simple, but actually that's not true, because they can be kind of unsatisfying, bit of a waste of time, you know. Whereas when you're making proper decisions, what you want is data that's clearly conveyed so that you can understand it. And the example that Tuft gives is an OS map. Even though he's American, he talks about the British mapping method of Ordnance Survey, which is actually really data dense, but is really easy to interpret. And so I wanted to explore this, and so that I did data density. If you also saw the middle image that I used with the timestamps, so we were using data from a video with the timing so that we could see what order a decision we're making and how it evolved. So that kind of thing. I'll hand over to Lauren now. I gave a couple of examples.
Yeah, so I use visual data alongside verbal data. So that can be in the form of individual interviews, but it can also be with a focus group discussion. And in recent times, in the recent Cambodia project in garment workers in Cambodia project, we also use things like, well, it's probably actually more relevant to what Nicola was talking about visual outputs. But we essentially took lots of the women garment workers' stories and then asked a Cambodian director to make mini videos, so fictionalized accounts of what the participants had told us, to visually capture the experiences of these garment workers throughout COVID, which is what the project was looking at. So again, thinking about how we might translate a form of data or a story into another way of, for us, connecting with policymakers, because we were trying to influence policy with this particular research. So actually having fictionalized videos, you immediately connect with audiences in a different way. They're not going to sit and read through a really long, boring report, but they will watch a 5-minute YouTube video. So, and I'll link them in the box actually, so you can have a look at what I mean by that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I think something that both of you have alluded to is regarding ethics, which I think perhaps is something that we don't immediately think of when it comes to visuals. For any colleagues or scholars who are now considering, inspired by your talks, to consider using visuals as part of their, as complementary data source, perhaps, what is it, do you think, that they, the key things they really need to be thinking about if they start to move into this space regarding the ethics?
Shall I talk about using photographs? Because that's a good way of capturing images quite quickly. So in the UK, you can take a photograph in any public space. If you are harassing people, you might get asked to not do that. If you are doing that, make sure you've kind of got it to part of your ethics and you've got a university ID on you, so that you can show that you're a legitimate researcher. A lot of the time when we're taking photographs, it won't be in a public space, so it will be in someone's place of work. So you need to make sure that they're aware that you're going to be taking photographs, and that you might also inadvertently photograph something in the background. So you need to be careful about that. Now, the image management protocol we developed was for a healthcare location where there might be sensitive data, data relating to patients. So what the protocol we developed was about the photograph being in the ownership of the organization we're working with. They would then remove anything sensitive through blurring. Then we would only save the blurred image, so that they're not letting anything go inadvertently that they don't want to. Okay. But a photograph is a really good way of remembering when you're gathering a lot of data. I expect Lauren had this. When you're gathering a lot of data, it's really helpful to say, oh yeah, that was the guy who said this. So it is really useful, even if you're not going to use that image. And you have to have a developer sense of trust. So you've got to think through that protocol and have that part of the informed consent, both of the organization and the individual. Oh, and I want to say so sometimes people choose to blur people's faces, but sometimes people regard that as dehumanizing. So you need to know at an individual level what people are okay and not okay with.
Okay. I would just add that for publication purposes, also lots of journals will need you to demonstrate that not only did you follow all the ethical protocols for your particular institution, but then you have the permissions to share your particular image within the publication itself. So it's not too difficult if it's your own photograph, but if you're, say, analysing found images. So I've got some colleagues who wrote a paper where they were analysing adverts, for example. Now, to get the permissions to re-show them within a journal article was nigh on impossible. So in the end, they had to sort of freehand sketch the adverts so that then that image was their own, and then they could publish that within the journal article. So that was a way around it. But just thinking through kind of the I guess, logistics of using visual data into publication. It's not so hard now because we have online publication, so you can have appendices and so on. But I mean, in the old days when we were just talking about analog publishing, there would have been hard limits on how many images, how many appendices, and so on.
I'm just going to add, I always encourage my researchers to take their own photographs because then they can freely use them. And they're really useful for when you're doing presentations, to give lovely, like the lovely photographs that Lauren had. They give context, they add warmth, it enables people to understand what you're doing. So as a researcher, it's a really good idea if it's okay to take photographs.
Yeah. Amazing, thank you. I can see we've got another question from Lara, which is directed at Lauren. So I don't know if you can see it in the chat box as well. So she says, so Lara asks, how did you approach the analysis of the visuals to ensure you stayed close to local ways of interpretation? I assume that just as there are local words that can't be translated, so to say, the same holds for the visuals.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And that's why in the end, in the Ghanaian case, we had those co-created symbols to help us capture the meaning of, so for example, a little drawing symbol of a machete was, this is the work for weeding the land. And those symbols were co-created with the local NGO and the supplier, who obviously got more of an understanding of, well, the realities of cocoa farming than I have. But when I've tried to do more freehand drawing in other sectors, and one of my PhD students, Divya Patel, she did drawing with entrepreneurs in India. Sometimes there needs to be almost like a follow-up interview where you're discussing the visual to make sure that you are understanding the meaning in the same way, because there can be this kind of like misunderstanding of what you've drawn, this lotus flower, but what do you mean by that? It's just an example. And again, we have a chapter that was published in one of Emma Bell's books, Empowering Methodologies, which is a fantastic read. Not just our chapter, that sounded very big-headed, the book itself. So yeah, have a look at that, because I think lots of those chapters are really thoughtfully grappling with these questions, like you've asked Lara about, how do we actually meaningfully interpret across cultures and different meanings and so on.
Yeah, great question. Thank you very much for that, Lauren. And something also very topical coming up in the chat box here as well. So thank you, Tribowo, for your question. And perhaps I'll direct this to Nicola because I'm sure this is something that you have been noticing in recent years. But the question is, with the increasing use of AI-generated images and synthetic visual content, how can researchers verify the authenticity and trustworthiness of visual data used in supply chain management research?
It depends where you're getting this data from. I would say generally this kind of echoes one of the things that I would emphasize, which is how do we verify any kind of data? So one might use, for instance, triangulation and richness of data. And of course, we've always been able to generate images just by drawing them, or 150 years ago through use of what might have been called trick photography. So there's always been ability to generate these images, but it's through the general approaches for verifying data. And I would always be suspicious of something that looks too smooth, and so I tend to deliberately not try to show my images are slightly rough, because that adds an authenticity to them. But then you can show the data trail from where it's been generated as well.
Thanks, Nicola. Lauren, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question? Is that something?
Well, I think with participant-led methods, we're still, thankfully, quite manual.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose a question that might be on the minds of lots of scholars, particularly who are looking to maybe move into this space and then obviously publish their research, In your experiences of publishing then, I presume there might be challenges in publishing this type of work, particularly in spaces where it's less common. So what would your advice be, based on your experiences of the challenges or any pushback or anything on these sorts of methods? What would your advice be in terms of how to navigate that publication process effectively to get this type of work published?
So first of all, I would say that lots of journals are becoming much more open-minded with visual methods. So I would say don't be put off. I have found that having published a methodology paper on using visual methods, that was very helpful for me then to publish empirical work using that visual data, because I could almost sort of reference that other paper to say, these are the detailed steps of how we did this particular work. I mean, sadly, so that I have a paper that was in organisation studies, which is about the gender equality in Ghana case, and in the end, the visual data became smaller and smaller and smaller story, and the verbal data kind of became privileged through the review process. There was a lot more emphasis from the reviewers about the verbal, and so that, for me, to be honest, was always a little bit of a disappointment, because the actual project was always 50-50 visual verbal, and the end result was not quite the same. So I think, I mean, now I think I would push back a little bit more with the reviewers and really kind of emphasize, what does the visual give me that the other data sources do not? And that's what's really, really key. And the other thing I would say is that you need to be very, very clear on your analysis. So because reviewers and editors are less familiar with the visual, you're going to have to really handheld them through, these are the steps of the analysis I did for the visuals. Yes, it's thematic, but what would that look like? How were you looking at that particular image? Are you looking at symbols, or are you looking at colours? Really help them understand, even if it means adding, you know, a reviewer appendix that you then can remove later. But yeah, just a kind of extra help, I think, for the editor and the reviewer.
Thanks, Lauren. That's really insightful. Something I definitely hadn't thought of. Yeah, so thank you for that. And Nicola, would you like to have the last word on this and before we close?
Yeah, so the approach of journals varies enormously. I would also say what they actually have on their websites is usually horribly out of date. So I would say don't necessarily rely on what is on the journal's websites. So I can give two. So the editor of the Journal of Operations Management, the American journal, is Elliot Bendoley, who's very supportive. However, he's also very knowledgeable, so quite tough to get past. So quite an interesting one. Some journals are now using visual editors. So the British Medical Journal has a visual editor. And you can ask for it to go past their visual editor if you want. But I would say on the whole, pretty challenging, because you've got a whole level of complexity, and reviewers might not feel comfortable with that. I think Lauren's advice is really helpful. Yeah, so yeah, Lauren's advice is really helpful. You might have to add a whole load of support for reviewers.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Nicola and Lauren. I think we've seen from today's discussion that what you can get from visuals you can't get from other data is clear, is rich and insightful, and so really leaning into that and demonstrating that through your writing as well is going to be great. So we are at 3 o'clock, so we will have to leave it there, or 4 o'clock, or 3 o'clock in the UK anyway. And I want to say a very final thank you to our speakers, Nicola Bateman and Lauren McCarthy. Thank you all for joining and for sharing your questions, and hopefully see you at the next one. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.